Arabella Fairfax stood in the smallest side room of the Thornbury Gallery on a May evening in 1851, her hands clasped rigidly behind her back where no one could see them, trembling, and watched London society dissect 3 years of her life with the casual cruelty of people who had never created anything that mattered. The gallery's high ceilings soared above her, gas-lit chandeliers casting warm golden light across gilt frames and polished floors, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and the expensive perfumes worn by women whose greatest artistic achievement was arranging flowers in crystal vases. Her 6 paintings hung on these walls like confessions she now regretted making, dark, moody landscapes of the Yorkshire moors she had painted with such hope, such conviction that honesty in art might be valued over prettiness, but the fashionable crowd flowing through the exhibition opening treated her work the way one might regard an unfortunate accident, something to glance at briefly before moving on to more pleasant sights. She was 28 years old, past the age when society expected a woman to have secured a husband and started producing children instead of paintings. And she had spent those years that should have gone to dancing and flirting, locked in cold studios trying to capture on canvas what she saw when she looked at the world, the power and wildness and terrible beauty that existed beyond the safe boundaries of what women were supposed to notice. Mr. Whitmore, the gallery owner, had agreed to exhibit her work only because her late father had been a respected scholar, though impoverished, and the man had known her since childhood, when she would trail after her father to lectures with paint already staining her small fingers. But even that old connection could not protect her from what was happening now in these elegant rooms. The main gallery beyond the doorway rang with laughter and animated conversation, champagne flutes catching the light as London's artistic elite celebrated the proper paintings hung there, pastoral scenes and delicate watercolors and historical tableaus that confirmed everything society already believed about art and beauty and the natural order of things, while in her small side room the silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Lady Henrietta Dashwood swept past her paintings with barely a glance, her voice carrying clearly as she pronounced to her companions that the work was disturbingly masculine in execution, that one could hardly believe a woman had painted such harsh, aggressive landscapes, and Arabella felt something in her chest go very still and cold as she memorized the woman's face, the casual dismissal in her expression. Lord Thomas Gardiner paused longer, studying her painting of a windswept heath under threatening skies, and she allowed herself a moment of hope before he turned to his companion and declared it the unfortunate product of allowing women access to serious materials, his tone suggesting she had somehow stolen the oils and canvas and brushes that she had saved for months to purchase. But the worst came when Sir Edmund Morland arrived, the celebrated art critic whose reviews could make or destroy careers, and he stood before her largest painting, with his arms crossed and his expression that of a disappointed schoolmaster, faced with a student who had failed to grasp a simple lesson. "One can discern competent technique, certainly," he announced loudly to the cluster of patrons gathering around him like disciples. "But where is the heart, the feminine grace these landscapes assault rather than soothe? Art from a woman should be like the woman herself, pleasing, gentle, decorative. This is aggressive." Lady Dashwood laughed at this pronouncement, a crystalline sound that cut through Arabella like glass, and added that perhaps Miss Fairfax was attempting to paint like a man, having failed to secure one, and the gathered crowd tittered appreciatively at the wit, while Arabella stood very still with her grey-green eyes dry, despite the humiliation burning in her chest like swallowed fire. She studied each face, memorizing their disdain, storing it away in the place where she kept every slight and dismissal she had endured for choosing to see the world with an artist's eyes instead of a marriageable woman's calculated glances. Her paintings hung on these walls like pieces of her soul made visible, the Yorkshire moors she had tramped across in all weather with her portable easel and her determination to capture truth rather than sentiment, the ancient stones standing against vast skies, the wild heaths where wind bent the grasses into patterns that spoke of forces larger than human concerns, the threatening beauty of storms rolling across landscapes that had existed long before London's drawing rooms, and would exist long after. And these people looked at her truth and found it wanting because it did not conform to their narrow definitions of what a woman's vision should contain. Mr. Whitmore appeared at her elbow, his expression uncomfortable, suggesting quietly that perhaps she might consider removing the paintings to avoid further embarrassment, that this exhibition was clearly not finding the reception they had hoped for, and Arabella turned to him with cold dignity that came from some deep reserve she had not known she possessed. "The exhibition runs 3 days," she told him with brittle precision. "My contract stipulates the full term." Her younger sister Lydia materialized from the crowd like a beautiful reproach, 22 years old, and recently engaged to a wealthy merchant, everything about her soft and pleasing in the way society demanded, her face arranged in public concern that dissolved into hissing anger the moment they were relatively alone near the paintings. "You are making a spectacle of the family name," Lydia whispered with sharp urgency. "You have always been selfish, Arabella. Your eccentricities reflect on my prospects too. Cannot you see that? Cannot you for once consider someone beyond your own stubborn need to be different?" The words landed like blows, but Arabella had been absorbing such blows for years, learning to stand steady under the weight of others' disappointment in her failure to be what they needed her to be. She had painted what she saw and felt, she told Mr. Whitmore when he returned with another suggestion that she might reconsider. If society finds honest emotion in landscape distasteful, that speaks more to society's limitations than to my work's merit. But her defiant words could not erase the sound of 3 young debutantes giggling in the corner, their voices floating across the room with the casual cruelty of youth that has not yet learned to moderate its mockery. Poor Miss Fairfax should abandon her brushes and focus on finding a husband before she is entirely on the shelf, one of them said, and the others agreed with more laughter, and Arabella felt the last of her composure beginning to crack under the accumulated weight of this public dissection. The contrast between the main gallery's vibrant social scene and her isolated position in this side room became unbearable, the sound of confident laughter and animated discussion about proper paintings echoing while she stood alone beside her failures, and she made the decision to leave before the formal reception dinner, unable to endure further examination by people who would never understand what she had tried to accomplish. She walked through the gallery with her head high and her hands still clasped behind her back, past the crowds gathered around watercolor roses and gentle pastoral scenes, past the champagne and the candlelight, and the glittering company, her footsteps echoing on polished floors as she made her way to the exit. In the carriage afterward, Lydia continued her recriminations, her pretty face twisted with frustration at a sister who refused to conform to the patterns that made life navigable for conventional women. "You could have painted flowers, Bella, watercolor roses, something pretty," Lydia said with exhausted exasperation. "But no, you must always be different, always prove something, and to what end? Humiliation and ruin." Arabella stared out the window at London's darkening streets, at the gaslights beginning to glow against the gathering dusk, and did not answer, because there was no answer that Lydia would understand, no way to explain that painting what was true mattered more than painting what was safe, even if truth led exactly where her sister predicted, to social ruin and confirmed spinsterhood, and the knowledge that she had spent 3 years creating work that the world had decisively rejected. The evening air felt cold against her face as the carriage rolled through streets filled with people moving toward their own destinations, their own dinners and conversations and ordinary lives, while she carried inside her chest the weight of this public failure, the devastating confirmation that her vision of the world, her honest attempt to capture on canvas what she saw when she looked at Yorkshire's wild landscapes, was not merely unwanted but actively offensive to the very people whose approval determined whether an artist's work would survive or disappear into obscurity. Arabella retreated to her modest lodgings in Bloomsbury like a wounded animal seeking shelter, the the cramped rooms she shared with her widowed aunt Beatrice Tilney, feeling both like sanctuary and prison as she climbed the narrow stairs to the floor, where canvases were stacked against walls, and the perpetual smell of linseed oil and turpentine hung in air that never quite cleared. Her aunt, a former governess who had spent 30 years teaching other people's children with patient dignity, asked no questions when Arabella arrived home early from the exhibition, merely prepared tea and sat quietly in the corner of the small parlour, while her niece stared at the worn furniture and inadequate northern light streaming through windows that had never been quite right for painting, but were all she could afford. For 5 days Arabella could not bring herself to paint, standing before blank canvases that seemed to mock her with their emptiness, their potential that she had somehow squandered by trusting that honesty in art might be valued over prettiness. And London papers arrived each morning with reviews that echoed and amplified the gallery's criticism until she felt she was drowning in other people's certainty that her vision was fundamentally flawed. She forced herself to read every cruel word, sitting in her small bedroom surrounded by clipped reviews spread across the faded counterpane, absorbing each pronouncement that her work lacked feminine sensibility, that her technique might be competent, but her emotional register was all wrong, that she had failed in the essential task of creating art that soothed rather than disturbed. On the 3rd night, her aunt found her at 3 a.m. with paint-stained hands, having destroyed a half-finished canvas in a fit of rage and grief that left her shaking. Turpentine splattered across the floor, and pieces of torn canvas scattered like evidence of violence, and Beatrice Tilney brought tea and sat beside her niece without speaking until the trembling stopped. I spent 30 years teaching other people's children because I was told a woman of my station had no other respectable choice, her aunt said finally, in the grey light before dawn. I loved those children, but Arabella, I never once painted, though my fingers itched for it. Don't become me. Don't look back at 60 and wonder who you might have been. The words settled into Arabella's chest like stones, heavy and true. But she did not know how to not become her aunt when society had made it devastatingly clear that there was no place for women who insisted on seeing and painting the world as it actually was rather than as comfortable convention preferred. On the 6th day, her aunt's solicitor, Mr. Benedict Wentworth, arrived with his leather portfolio and formal manner, requesting a private meeting in the small parlour that served as dining room and sitting room, and every other kind of room in their cramped lodgings, and Arabella sat across from him with no expectation of anything but perhaps some final bill from her father's estate, some last reminder of debts and obligations. The news he brought was so unexpected that she had to ask him to repeat it, certain she had misheard, that grief and exhaustion had confused her understanding. A distant maternal uncle, a reclusive scholar named Thomas Fairfax, whom Arabella barely remembered meeting once as a child, had died in the Lake District and left her a small cottage with an annual income of £150, barely enough to live on by London standards, but enough for independence if one was willing to live simply, and the only condition was that she must reside there for 1 year before the inheritance was finalized. She read the documents Mr. Wentworth spread across the mahogany and leather surfaces of his office, which smelled of old paper and sealing wax, the inheritance laid out with formal precision in language that seemed both miraculous and terrifying. There was a personal note from her uncle in handwriting that trembled with age or illness, and she read it aloud to herself in wonderment. "You are the only one who inherited the family madness," he had written. "The need to capture the world as it is, not as society wishes it to be. The cottage was my refuge. May it be yours." Arabella felt something shift in her chest, a wild, terrifying hope that perhaps there was a way forward that did not require her to apologize for her vision, or soften her work, or become the kind of woman who painted watercolor roses because roses were safe. Lydia arrived within hours of hearing the news, her pretty face flushed with outrage, insisting that Arabella refuse this inheritance and remain in London to repair her reputation through proper behavior, through the kind of quiet feminine conformity that might eventually make society forget the embarrassment of the exhibition. Their mother, an invalid who depended entirely on Lydia's upcoming marriage for security and comfort, agreed from her sickbed that Arabella should stay, should make herself useful and unobtrusive, and perhaps eventually marriageable if she would only abandon her artistic pretensions. "You are being selfish," Lydia said with the particular sharpness that came from fear. "Mother needs me to marry well, which requires our family to be respectable. Your eccentricities endanger everything. Can you not see that your choices affect more than just yourself?" But Aunt Beatrice sat quietly in the corner with her hands folded and her expression serene. And when Arabella looked at her aunt, she saw in that weathered face the ghost of who she herself might become if she stayed. A woman who had swallowed her own dreams to meet others' needs, who had lived a good, useful life, but never the life her soul had hungered for. "Sometimes we must lose ourselves to find ourselves, my dear," Beatrice said softly, and the words felt like permission, like benediction. Arabella made her decision with a quiet steel she had not known she possessed, meeting Lydia's angry gaze with steady grey-green eyes that no longer flinched from disapproval. "Then I shall be unmarriageable," she told her sister, "but I will be myself, and I release you from association with me. Tell society I have gone to tend a sick relation. Tell them anything, but I will not apologize for seeing the world in color and storm rather than in pastel pleasantries." The confrontation left her shaking but certain, and she spent the next days making arrangements to leave London entirely, packing her paints and brushes and canvases with a sense of purpose that had been absent since the exhibition's devastating opening. On the final day of the exhibition, she went to the Thornbury Gallery to collect her paintings, arriving early in the morning when the rooms were empty and quiet, dust motes floating in slanted sunlight that made the space feel abandoned and melancholy. The gallery had the hollow echo of places meant for crowds when crowds have departed, and her 6 paintings hung in the small side room, looking somehow different in this solitude, stronger and more defiant without the weight of society's judgment pressing down on them. She found Mr. Whitmore in conversation with a tall, distinguished gentleman whose dark hair caught the morning light, the 2 men standing before her largest landscape, with an intensity of focus that made her pause in the doorway. The gentleman stood utterly still as he examined her painting of the Yorkshire moors under threatening skies, his posture suggesting the kind of deep concentration she recognized from her own hours studying landscape and light. And even in her hurried, defensive state, she noticed the quality of his attention, the way he seemed to be truly seeing rather than merely looking. But humiliation and wariness made her cold, made her interrupt before Mr. Whitmore could turn and make introductions, her voice brittle as she informed them that she had come to remove the offensive pieces, the words deliberate and sharp. Mr. Whitmore's face registered surprise, and then dismay, his mouth opening to speak, but Arabella was already moving toward her paintings with swift efficiency, not wanting to hear whatever polite dismissal or awkward explanation he might offer. "That is Miss Fairfax herself, Your Grace," she heard Mr. Whitmore say, as she began unhooking the first canvas. "I tried to tell you she had already requested the painting's return. She is quite proud," but Arabella did not pause to consider who this gentleman might be or what title the gallery owner had used, wanting only to escape with the remnants of her dignity and her work. She departed before Mr. Whitmore could explain that the gentleman wished to purchase the paintings, her arms full of canvas and her heart full of the bitter certainty that she was doing the right thing in leaving London, in accepting her uncle's inheritance and retreating to the Lake District, where she would not have to endure the particular torture of watching society dissect and dismiss her attempts to create something true. The mystery gentleman remained only an impression as she left, tall and dark-haired and utterly focused on her work in a way that felt different from the gallery crowds, but which she was too raw to examine, too defensive to trust. Later, in the carriage taking her away from the gallery with her 6 paintings wrapped and secured, She allowed herself to wonder briefly who he had been and what he had wanted. But the wondering felt dangerous, like hoping for validation from a world that had made its judgment clear. The inheritance documents rested in her reticule, along with her uncle's letter about family madness and refuge, and she touched the papers through the fabric as the carriage rolled through London streets she would soon be leaving, perhaps forever. Her decision was made, radical and irreversible, to pursue authentic self-expression even at tremendous social cost, to choose isolation and artistic integrity over any possibility of society's approval, and if that meant she would be unmarriageable and eccentric and lost to conventional feminine life, then so be it, because she could not go back to pretending that her vision of the world was wrong simply because it made comfortable people uncomfortable, could not spend the rest of her life painting watercolor roses when her soul saw storms and ancient stones and the terrible beauty of landscapes that existed beyond human control or comprehension. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 3 months passed in the Lake District like a slow exhale after years of holding her breath, and Arabella settled into Dove Cottage in Grasmere with a sense of homecoming she had never experienced in London's cramped lodgings or her family's disapproving presence. The cottage was small and stone, with low ceilings and deep-set windows, surrounded by wild gardens that had gone untended during her uncle's final years, and sheltered by ancient oaks that had stood witness to generations of solitary souls seeking refuge from the world's demands. The interior was sparse but comfortable, and within days every available surface was covered in sketches and paint supplies and half-finished canvases as Arabella claimed the space completely for her art, no longer constrained by thoughts of what visitors might think or how a proper lady's rooms should appear. The isolation and natural beauty of the fells and lakes gradually healed something in her wounded creative spirit that she had not known could be healed, and she found herself rising with the sun to paint in all weather, her hands perpetually stained with oils and her hair escaping its pins as she tramped across the countryside with her portable easel and her rekindled conviction that what she saw mattered. The physical transformation was subtle but profound as color returned to her cheeks from hours outdoors in wind and sun, a wildness entering her grey-green eyes that replaced the guarded caution London had taught her, the rigid society posture relaxing into a painter's focused intensity as she stood before her canvases completely absorbed in the work of capturing truth. She painted obsessively without thought of exhibition or approval, stormy skies over Rydal water where light broke through clouds in shafts that seemed almost divine, the ancient stones of Castlerigg Stone Circle standing against vast skies in arrangements that spoke of purposes lost to time, the raw power of Ira Force waterfall where water crashed over rocks with a violence that was beautiful precisely because it was indifferent to human aesthetics. Her work grew bolder and more confident with each piece, the paintings in her cottage studio more powerful than anything she had created for the London exhibition, because they came from a place of freedom rather than the desperate need to prove something to people who had already decided she was wrong. She befriended Mrs. Clara Bennet, a widow who ran the village postal office and general shop, a practical woman with kind eyes who asked no intrusive questions about why a gentlewoman was living alone in a cottage painting landscapes instead of pursuing marriage and respectability. The small artistic community in the area included a poet named William Dashwood, who occupied a neighbouring cottage and who would stop by occasionally to discuss art and literature with the kind of serious respect Arabella had never received from London society, encouraging her to trust her vision and reminding her that all truly original work was initially rejected by those too comfortable to recognize innovation. The Lake District in autumn was copper and gold bracken on the fells, mist rising from the lake at dawn, while ravens cried overhead, the smell of peat smoke and rain mixing with the sharp, clean scent of air that had never known London's coal-fouled atmosphere. And Arabella felt herself becoming someone new in this landscape, or perhaps becoming who she had always been beneath the layers of social expectation and feminine performance. One November morning, Mrs. Bennet arrived at the cottage with barely contained excitement, a letter in her hands, and her expression suggesting this was no ordinary correspondence. "From London, Miss Fairfax," she announced, with the particular emphasis of someone who recognized quality paper and formal seals, and such fine paper too. "This is quality correspondence, mark me." Arabella took the letter with hands that had been mixing paint moments before, leaving smudges on the expensive paper as she broke the seal and read Mr. Whitmore's precise script, and she had to read the contents 3 times before the words made any sense at all. A private patron had purchased all 6 of her paintings from the exhibition for an extraordinary sum of £500. Nearly 4 years of her inheritance income, an amount of money that seemed impossible for work that had been so thoroughly rejected and dismissed. More stunning still, the patron requested to commission 12 new works with subject of artist's choice for £1,200 with half paid in advance, no restrictions or requirements except that the paintings be true to her vision, and Arabella read these phrases aloud to herself, in disbelief. Subject of artist's choice, true to her vision, how is this possible? "Who would—" she said to the empty cottage, then with bitter suspicion rising, "unless it is mockery, perhaps they wish to purchase my failures to display as cautionary examples, warnings against allowing women to attempt serious art." But William Dashwood, stopping by that afternoon and hearing the news, shook his head at her suspicion with the gentle firmness of someone who understood artistic self-doubt. "Or perhaps, Miss Fairfax, someone actually sees what I see," he told her, "that your work holds more truth than all the pretty parlor watercolors in Mayfair combined. Perhaps someone has eyes to recognize genuine vision when it appears." The patron wished to remain anonymous, but would send a representative to discuss terms, and Arabella spent a feverish week torn between hope and wariness, cleaning the cottage and then deliberately messing it again because she refused to perform proper ladylike domesticity for anyone, practicing cold speeches of refusal in case this was some elaborate cruelty, and then tearing them up because she could not quite kill the wild hope growing in her chest. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, a private carriage appeared on the narrow road to the cottage, far too fine for the rustic surroundings, and Arabella watched from her studio window as it approached with her heart beating hard against her ribs. She had paint on her cheek and wore a simple work dress with her hair hastily pinned when she answered the door, expecting some London servant in livery, but instead found herself facing a tall gentleman of perhaps 35 years, with dark hair silvered at the temples and storm-grey eyes that held an intensity mirroring her own. The contrast between his London formality, the perfectly tailored travelling coat and polished boots, and her artistic chaos was almost comical, and for a moment they simply stared at each other in mutual assessment. Then recognition hit Arabella like a physical blow as she placed his features, the resemblance to Sir Edmund Morland unmistakable in the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and shock made her voice sharp. "You are Edmund Morland's brother," she said, not a question but an accusation, and the gentleman inclined his head with careful courtesy. "Yes, I am Edmund's brother," he confirmed. "But I am not Edmund. May I come in, Miss Fairfax? I have travelled 2 days to discuss your art, and I promise you it is not to insult it." She stood blocking the doorway with defensive fierceness rising in her chest because this man's brother had destroyed her confidence and humiliated her publicly, had called her work emotionally barren and lacking in feminine sensibility, had set the tone for every cruel review that followed. "Your brother called my work emotionally barren," she said with barely controlled anger. "He suggested I lacked feminine sensibility. Why should I trust that you see anything different? Why should I believe this is not some elaborate mockery?" Sebastian Morland met her anger with quiet devastation in his expression, a sincerity that was difficult to doubt, even as she tried to maintain her suspicion. "Because I am the one who bought every painting the day after the exhibition opened," he said softly. "Because I have spent 3 months unable to stop thinking about them. And because, Miss Fairfax, I believe you are the most important artist working in England today, and I intend to prove it to the world that mocked you." The words hung in the cold November air between them, and Arabella felt something in her chest crack open, the careful protective walls she had built threatening to crumble under the weight of validation she had stopped believing possible. She stepped back wordlessly and let him enter the cottage, watching as his gaze immediately went to the dozen new paintings in various stages of completion that dominated her small studio space. The quality of light in the cottage was northern exposure, clear and true, illuminating her work with the kind of honest brightness that hid nothing. And Sebastian Morland stood very still as he examined what she had created in her 3 months of isolation and freedom. She watched him looking at her paintings, the way she had briefly noticed him looking at her work in the gallery that terrible morning when she had fled rather than hear whatever he might say. And she recognized in his absolute focus the same quality of attention she herself gave to landscape and light, the concentration of someone who was truly seeing rather than performing the act of looking. He introduced himself properly then, Sebastian Morland, Duke of Thornbury, and the title explained the private carriage and the extraordinary sums of money mentioned in Mr. Whitmore's letter, but it also complicated everything because dukes did not champion unknown female artists without reasons that society would immediately assume were improper. She had recognized with shock that he was connected to her primary critic, the relationship making his admiration immediately suspect. But as he moved through her cottage studio, examining each painting with careful attention and asking questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of technique and vision, she found it increasingly difficult to maintain her defensive wariness. He spoke of art the way she thought about art, discussed light and composition and emotional truth with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying seriously rather than collecting fashionably. And when he paused before her painting of Castlereagh Stone Circle with an expression of something like wonder, she felt the first crack in her certainty that this must be some kind of trap. The Lake District landscape, visible through her cottage windows, seemed to approve of his presence, the fells rising in the distance under clouds that promised rain, and Arabella found herself thinking that perhaps William Dashwood had been right. Perhaps someone did actually see what she saw. Perhaps genuine recognition was possible, even from the brother of the man who had most thoroughly dismissed her work. Sebastian turned from the paintings to look at her directly, and in his storm-grey eyes she saw reflected the same intensity and isolation that drove her own artistic obsession, the quality of someone who understood that seeing truly often meant standing apart from comfortable consensus. This is the turning point, she thought, as November wind rattled the cottage windows and her future balanced on the edge of whether to trust this unexpected validation or retreat further into protective solitude. This is where her journey from humiliation might actually lead toward something beyond mere survival, and the terror of hope felt almost as overwhelming as the earlier devastation of rejection. Sebastian stayed at the local inn, but appeared at Dove Cottage each morning over the next week with the regularity of sunrise, and Arabella found her initial wariness gradually melting as he demonstrated not merely polite interest, but genuine knowledge and sophisticated appreciation of her work that went far beyond anything she had encountered in London's artistic circles. He was 36 years old. She learned during their first long conversation, the Duke of Thornbury with responsibilities and power she could barely fathom, but while his older brother Edmund had pursued art criticism and society prominence, Sebastian had focused his considerable intelligence on politics and social reform. He sat in Parliament and had been fighting for workers' rights and education reform, causes that made him controversial among his conservative peers, who preferred their dukes concerned with hunting and estates rather than the conditions in factories and mines. He explained over tea in her small cottage that he wanted her paintings for the parliamentary library and committee rooms to challenge the staid conventional art that currently hung there, portraits of dead politicians and sanitized battle scenes that reinforced comfortable assumptions rather than provoking genuine thought. He believed art should provoke thought and emotion rather than merely decorate, should make people uncomfortable enough to question their certainties. And as he spoke, Arabella recognized in his political philosophy the same conviction that drove her artistic vision, the insistence that truth mattered more than comfort. Their discussions ranged from art to politics to literature with an ease that astonished her, and she found herself intellectually challenged in ways she had never experienced, pushed to articulate her artistic philosophy by someone who actually cared about the answers rather than asking questions designed to expose her presumption in attempting serious work. Sebastian had a sophisticated understanding of painting that became evident as they examined her canvases together, discussing technique and composition with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying rather than merely collecting. And when she remarked skeptically that he spoke as one who paints, though he claimed to be a politician, his expression shifted into something vulnerable and grieving. "My mother painted," he told her quietly. "She died when I was 12, but before that she taught me to see, to really see, rather than just look. She would have loved your work, Miss Fairfax. She painted what she felt too, though she was never brave enough to show it publicly. The few canvases that survive are locked in my private gallery because my father found them too disturbing for public display." Arabella felt her heart contract with sympathy for both the lost mother and the boy who had learned to truly see and then watched his mother's vision be locked away and silenced. "I am sorry," she said with genuine feeling, "for your loss and for her silenced voice, for all the women who see truly, but are never allowed to show what they see." Sebastian's storm-grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be brave enough for both of you. That is why I am here, because watching you be eviscerated by people like my brother, people who would not recognize genuine artistic vision if it struck them like lightning, was unbearable. Someone must champion work that matters, even if, especially if, it makes comfortable people uncomfortable." The week progressed with a rhythm that felt both natural and charged with awareness, Sebastian arriving each morning and staying until darkness forced his departure to the inn, their professional discussions of the commission gradually incorporating more personal revelations and unexpected moments of connection. Arabella was surprised when he rolled up his sleeves one afternoon and helped her stretch a new canvas, his hands familiar with the physical labor of art-making, pulling the fabric taut with practiced efficiency that spoke of hours spent in studios watching his mother work. She caught him examining her paint-stained hands one evening as firelight flickered across the cottage interior, his gaze tracing the small scars from palette knives and the permanent stains that marked her as someone who worked with materials rather than merely directing servants, and the expression on his face was something she could not quite read, but that made her breath catch. Their first shared laugh came when she made a dry observation about London society's preference for art that matched their furniture, and Sebastian responded with equally sharp wit about peers who commissioned portraits to immortalize their hunting dogs with more care than they showed their tenants, and the sound of their combined laughter in the small cottage felt like a kind of intimacy she had not anticipated. They took daily walks to painting locations across the wind-swept fells, and along the edge of Grasmere, where morning mist rose from the water in shifting veils, to ancient stone circles where Sebastian would stand silent and still while she sketched, his presence somehow enhancing rather than intruding on her creative process. The cottage studio grew familiar to him over the week, and Arabella noticed how he unconsciously came to know where she kept certain supplies, how he would hand her brushes without being asked as if they had worked together for years rather than days. the casual domestic intimacy of these small gestures, more affecting than grand romantic declarations would have been. Evening conversations by firelight saw the formality of London manners giving way to something more honest as they discussed Sebastian's parliamentary battles and Arabella's artistic struggles. The contrast between his world of power and responsibility and massive social obligations and hers of isolation and financial precarity and freedom from social performance, creating a tension that somehow drew them together rather than pushing them apart. He confessed that he had been at the exhibition opening, had seen her standing alone by her paintings while society mocked her work, had heard every cruel comment, including his own brother's devastating pronouncement, and had been so appalled that he went to the gallery the next morning to purchase every painting before they could be destroyed or hidden away. "I bought them because I genuinely valued them," Sebastian told her with quiet intensity, "but also because I could not bear the thought of work that powerful being lost because the world was too comfortable to appreciate it, and I did not send a representative because I wanted to meet the artist who could create such truth while facing such opposition, who had the courage to show the world exactly what she saw, even knowing the world would reject it." The Lake District winter was approaching with earlier darkness and frost forming on the cottage windows, the cold weather creating a closeness and intimacy that the long summer days would not have permitted. And Arabella found herself aware of Sebastian's presence in ways that had nothing to do with his patronage or his political power, and everything to do with the quality of his attention when he looked at her work, when he looked at her. During a sketching expedition to capture the afternoon light on the fells, sudden rain forced them to shelter in a shepherd's hut, the enforced proximity in the small stone structure making them both acutely conscious of standing too close, of his hand steadying her elbow when she stumbled on rough ground, of the almost kiss that hovered between them for a breathless moment before they both stepped back and pretended the awareness did not exist. On the final day of his planned visit, Sebastian stood before her completed painting of a storm over Helvellyn and spoke with something like reverence in his voice. "This," he said, "you have captured something I have felt but never seen painted. The sublime, the terrible beauty of nature's indifference to human concerns. This is what Turner attempts but overlays with too much sentiment. You show the truth without softening it for comfortable consumption." Then he turned to face her directly and proposed not just the commission they had been discussing all week, but something far more radical and terrifying, a public exhibition of her new work in 6 months to be held in a parliamentary gallery space he could secure, with his patronage announced publicly so that all of London society would know that the Duke of Thornbury championed her vision. Arabella felt fear rise in her throat, sharp as broken glass, because they had destroyed her once, and he was asking her to offer herself for destruction again, to put her work and herself before the same cruel judgment that had nearly broken her creative spirit entirely. "And if the exhibition fails again," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "if they mock me again, but this time with your name attached, you will be damaged by association, your political work will be undermined by scandal." Sebastian met her fear with quiet intensity that reminded her why she had begun to trust him, despite every instinct toward self-protection. "Let them try," he said. "I have faced down the House of Lords over child labour reforms. I think I can withstand some art critics. Besides, Miss Fairfax, Arabella, if I may, I am not proposing this for you alone. British art is stagnating in sentimentality and safe prettiness. It needs disruption. It needs truth. It needs you." The use of her first name felt like a crossing of some invisible boundary, an acknowledgement of what had been building between them all week in conversations that ranged far beyond patron and artist into territory neither had explicitly named. The cottage studio around them was full of her new work, paintings more powerful than anything she had created for the London exhibition, because they came from a place of freedom and authentic vision, and she knew that what Sebastian proposed was both an extraordinary, opportunity, and a tremendous risk. That accepting meant trusting not just his judgment of her work, but his ability to withstand the social consequences of championing a woman artist who refused to conform to acceptable feminine aesthetics. She looked at him standing in her small cottage, with London formality somewhat abandoned after a week of tramping across fells and discussing art and politics with an honesty neither showed to their usual social circles. And she saw reflected in his expression the same combination of hope and wariness she felt. The vulnerability of offering something precious and waiting to see if it would be valued or destroyed. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the November wind moved through the ancient oaks sheltering the cottage, and Arabella understood that her answer would determine not just her artistic future, but the trajectory of whatever was developing between them. This connection built on genuine recognition and shared values and intellectual equality that felt more substantial than anything she had imagined possible between herself and another person, let alone a duke with parliamentary power and social standing she could never hope to approach. 6 months passed in correspondence and occasional visits as Arabella worked with obsessive focus to complete 12 monumental landscape paintings that represented her most ambitious work yet, each canvas 6 feet by 4 feet, designed to command walls and attention in ways her earlier modest pieces never could. Sebastian's letters arrived weekly from London, full of updates on parliamentary business and thoughtful questions about her artistic progress, and his visits to the Lake District grew longer and more frequent as winter gave way to spring, the professional boundaries between patron and artist becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as their conversations deepened and the awareness between them grew impossible to ignore. In May 1852, exactly 1 year after her humiliation at the Thornbury Gallery, Arabella returned to London and stayed with Aunt Beatrice in the familiar Bloomsbury lodgings, her aunt lending quiet strength as they prepared for an exhibition that felt like walking deliberately toward the site of an earlier devastation and daring the world to destroy her again. The morning of the opening, she dressed in a gown of deep forest green that Sebastian had suggested months earlier, the color of the fells in summer he had written, "Wear your landscape." And her hands shook as she fastened her mother's pearl earrings and tried to steady her breathing against the rising panic of exposing herself once more to London society's judgment. The Parliamentary Art Gallery was a prestigious space typically reserved for historical portraits of dead statesmen and sanitized battle scenes, high ceilings and oak paneling, and the scent of beeswax and old leather, gas lamps supplementing daylight from tall windows that overlooked the Thames. And when Arabella entered and saw her 12 paintings commanding entire walls in rooms where laws were debated and the future of Britain was decided, she felt something fierce and triumphant rise in her chest alongside the terror. Sebastian had announced his patronage publicly and used his political influence to ensure attendance by MPs and peers and crucially members of the press, transforming what could have been a small artistic event into something with genuine cultural and political significance. The exhibition was titled The Truthful Eye. Landscapes of Britain, and Sebastian had written a provocative foreword in the catalogue that Arabella read for the first time, standing in the gallery surrounded by her work. "Art that comforts us in our prejudices is decoration," he had written. "Art that challenges us to see anew is necessary." Miss Fairfax paints Britain as it is, powerful, often harsh, sublime in its refusal to be tamed or prettified. In doing so, she holds a mirror to our national character that is far more honest than the pastoral fantasies we prefer to hang in our drawing rooms. The words made her throat tight with emotion, because they articulated exactly what she had been attempting, but had never managed to express so clearly, and she looked across the gallery to where Sebastian stood receiving guests, and felt gratitude that went far beyond patron and artist into territory she was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. The opening was dramatically different from her first exhibition in every possible way. The room packed with people engaged in intense discussion rather than polite chit-chat. her paintings impossible to ignore or dismiss as they dominated the walls with their dark power. Storms over Helvellyn and ancient stones at Castlerig, and the industrial valley, where smoke met sunset in colours that spoke of what progress cost. Sebastian stood visibly beside her throughout the evening, not hovering protectively, but positioned as an equal, his body language making clear through subtle signals that he considered her his peer rather than some feminine curiosity he was indulging, and the impact of ducal approval on the crowd's reception was impossible to miss. The initial response was polarized exactly as Sebastian had predicted. Older conservative attendees shocked and dismissive, one elderly MP pronouncing loudly that Thornbury was championing this aggressive style because he had always been contrary, that this was not art but a political statement designed to provoke. But younger MPs and reformers and progressive thinkers were electrified by work that acknowledged the complexity of modern Britain rather than retreating into comfortable pastoral fantasy, and one young reformer approached Arabella with genuine enthusiasm to discuss her painting of the industrial valley. "Miss Fairfax," he said, with the earnestness of youth encountering something genuinely new, "your painting of the smoke against the sunset. It is the first artwork I have seen that acknowledges what we have done to our landscape. It is extraordinary." The Times had sent their senior art critic who engaged Arabella in serious discussion about her technique and vision, asking substantive questions about her use of color and light that treated her as a professional artist rather than an amusing anomaly, and she found herself answering with confidence she had not possessed a year earlier, her voice steady as she articulated her artistic philosophy to someone actually interested in understanding rather than dismissing it. Most satisfying were the women who sought her out, artists who painted in private and never dared exhibit, who approached with emotions barely controlled to express gratitude for her courage in showing work that defied feminine conventions. A young woman of perhaps 20 came to her with tears streaming down her face and gripped Arabella's hands. "You have shown me it is possible," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." And Arabella felt the weight of that gratitude settle into her bones because she understood exactly what it meant to believe yourself alone in seeing the world in ways that society deemed inappropriate for your sex. Then Sir Edmund Morland arrived, and the atmosphere in the gallery shifted instantly, conversations faltering and heads turning as people recognized the critic whose review had destroyed Arabella's first exhibition, the man who had pronounced her work emotionally barren and lacking in feminine sensibility. His face was dark with fury as he took in the crowded room and the prominent display of paintings he had dismissed, and Arabella felt shock course through her at seeing the man who had nearly destroyed her confidence now facing her across a space where she was being celebrated rather than mocked. Edmund's supporters unconsciously closed ranks around him, while Arabella's allies, the younger progressive MPs and artists who had been championing her work, moved subtly closer to her in protective formation, and the palpable tension made clear that this confrontation was about far more than one woman's paintings. Edmund strode directly to where Sebastian stood and addressed his brother with a voice pitched to carry across the gallery. "Brother," he said with cold contempt, "you demean yourself and this institution by using your position to promote work that was rightfully rejected by competent critics. Unless your interest in Miss Fairfax extends beyond her paintings, is this patronage, or is it something more personal and therefore corrupt?" The implication of scandal hung in the air like poison, the suggestion that Sebastian's support stemmed from improper romantic involvement rather than genuine artistic appreciation, and Arabella felt fury rise in her throat, sharp and bright, because Edmund was attempting to publicly humiliate Sebastian by using her and her work as weapons. The confrontation threatened to overshadow the exhibition entirely, reducing her artistic achievement to gossip about ducal impropriety, and she found herself stepping forward before conscious thought caught up with action, her voice clear and cold cutting through the shocked silence. "Sir Edmund," she said with devastating precision, You rejected my work because it did not conform to your narrow definition of how a woman should see and paint. You wanted delicacy and prettiness, the visual equivalent of a simpering curtsy. I gave you truth instead, storms and stone, and the sublime indifference of nature. You called it unfeminine. I call it honest." She turned to address the assembled crowd, who had gone absolutely silent, every eye fixed on her as she articulated what she had spent a year learning to say. "The question is not whether my work is inferior as Sir Edmund claims," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The question is whether British art will continue to confine women to painting flowers and children, or whether we will finally acknowledge that women's eyes see the same complex, challenging world men see, and that our artistic response to that world deserves the same serious consideration." The silence after her speech was absolute, and stretched for what felt like an eternity before scattered applause began, and then built until even some of Edmund's allies were clapping, and Arabella felt her legs trembling beneath her forest green gown, but kept her spine straight and her gaze level. Sebastian moved to stand beside her with an expression of pride and something fiercer that made her breath catch, and he addressed his brother with quiet devastation. "You called her work emotionally barren because you lack the emotional capacity to comprehend it," he said. "I pity you, brother. You have spent your life telling others what to see instead of learning to truly see yourself." The evening light was turning golden through the tall windows as the confrontation resolved, and conversations resumed at higher volume, falling on her painting of Ira Force waterfall, and making the painted water seem to move with captured light. And Arabella stood in the Parliamentary Art Gallery, surrounded by her 12 monumental landscapes, hanging in the seat of British power, and understood that she had transformed from victim of society's judgment to challenger of society's limitations, that the title's promise had been fulfilled not just in the literal hanging of her work in Parliament, but in her finding the voice and courage to defend her vision publicly against the very people who had nearly destroyed her. The exhibition was a critical success with progressive circles, but ignited a scandal in conservative society that spread through London like wildfire through dry brush, and within days Edmund Morland published a scathing editorial in the Morning Post that reduced Arabella's artistic achievement to nothing more than evidence of improper romantic involvement between herself and the Duke of Thornbury. One must question the Duke of Thornbury's judgment in elevating the work of Miss A.F. to "spaces reserved for our nation's finest artistic achievements," Edmund wrote with poisonous precision. "When a gentleman of his position shows such particular attention to an unmarried lady of no fortune, one cannot help but wonder whether his praise of her powerful vision extends to qualities unrelated to her paintings. The public has a right to expect that parliamentary resources serve the nation's interests, not a duke's private enthusiasms." The editorial struck exactly where it would cause maximum damage, suggesting that Sebastian was using his parliamentary position to promote his particular friend at taxpayer expense, and his opponents in Parliament seized on the scandal to undermine his reform efforts, with arguments that his judgment was clouded by personal entanglement. Several Conservative MPs called for the exhibition to be removed from parliamentary spaces immediately, framing the issue as one of propriety and proper use of public resources rather than engaging with the question of artistic merit at all. Arabella had returned to the Lake District after the opening, retreating to Dove Cottage to process the overwhelming experience of public validation and Edmund's confrontation, and the devastating news arrived through letters that accumulated on her small table like evidence of disaster. The exhibition might close early. Sebastian was facing a vote of censure, and London society, including her own family, was consumed with gossip about their illicit relationship, the scandal growing with each retelling until fact and fiction became impossible to separate. Lydia's letter arrived on particularly cruel stationery, expensive paper her merchant husband could afford, and the words were sharp with fear and anger. "You have once again proven yourself incapable of conducting yourself with proper feminine decorum," her sister wrote. "Your artistic career has brought nothing but shame to our family. Even my husband's family questions the connection now. I hope your paintings were worth the ruin of your reputation and mine." Arabella read the letter standing by her cottage window, with snow falling on the fells beyond. The isolation that had felt like freedom, now feeling confining and distant from the battle being waged over her work and her character in London's drawing rooms and parliamentary corridors. But the most painful correspondence came forwarded by Aunt Beatrice, a letter from Sebastian himself that was formal and distant. Everything their previous exchanges had not been, stripped of the warmth and intellectual intimacy that had characterized their months of communication. "The scandal has grown beyond what I anticipated," Sebastian wrote with careful precision. "My continued association with you damages your reputation and provides ammunition to those who oppose necessary reforms in Parliament. I cannot allow my personal feelings, whatever they may be, to destroy your future or the future of the legislation I have worked years to advance, please. Understand that my admiration for your work remains unchanged, but I must release you from our arrangement. Forgive me." Arabella felt something crack in her chest as she read his words, the formal politeness that created distance where there had been connection, the assumption that he could make decisions about her future without consulting her, the suggestion that protecting her reputation mattered more than allowing her to choose her own path. She was devastated, but also furious with a rage that burned hotter than grief, furious that society's prurient assumptions mattered more than artistic truth, furious that Sebastian would push her away to protect her, as if she were fragile porcelain rather than the woman who had survived public humiliation and rebuilt herself through sheer creative will, furious that her work was once again being dismissed as merely an extension of personal scandal rather than evaluated on its own considerable merits. She stood at her cottage window watching a storm roll over the fells, dark clouds gathering above Helvellyn and wind bending the bare winter trees, and she saw in nature's power a reflection of her own strength, the force she had been channeling into her paintings now demanding release in different form. She had not survived the first scandal by hiding or apologizing or softening herself to meet society's expectations. She had survived by creating work so true it could not be denied, and she would survive this the same way, by refusing to accept that her choices should be made by others concerned with protecting her from consequences she was willing to face. Aunt Beatrice arrived at the cottage within days of Arabella sending word that she needed her, and the older woman listened to the whole story, the exhibition and the scandal, and Sebastian's letter of release, before speaking with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent decades observing how the world treated women who dared to want more than assigned roles. "Go," her aunt said simply. "Fight for what matters. Fight for him if he matters. But fight for your work first. Fight for every woman who paints in secret and destroys her canvases rather than face the world's judgment. Fight because someone must, and you have already proven you have the courage even when it costs everything." Arabella made her bold decision then, standing in the cottage that had been her refuge, and recognizing that refuge could also become prison if she let fear keep her isolated from the battles that mattered. She would return to London not as a supplicant or victim, but as a woman claiming her right to be heard, and she would confront the scandal directly by writing a public letter to the Times that addressed the assumptions underlying all the gossip and innuendo. She spent days on the letter, draft after draft scattered across her work table, finding the precise words to articulate what she had never been able to say clearly, the systematic way society dismissed women's artistic vision by assuming it must be derivative or decorative, or in this case merely a pretext for romantic intrigue. Sir Edmund Morland and others suggest that the Duke of Thornbury's support of my work stems from improper personal interest. She wrote in her final draft, "I will address this directly. His Grace recognized the value of my paintings when others dismissed them. Whether personal feeling exists between us is irrelevant to the question of whether my work merits serious consideration. That society immediately assumes a powerful man must have ulterior motives for supporting a woman, artist reveals far more about society's prejudices than about either His Grace's judgment or my work's quality. If my paintings hang in Parliament, let them be judged on their artistic merit, and if I have captured the Duke's admiration, let that too be judged on its merits. Does his character suggest he would confuse artistic appreciation with romantic interest? Or does society simply find it impossible to believe a woman's work could be valued for itself? The letter was simultaneously a defense of her art and a challenge to the gendered assumptions that made scandal inevitable whenever a woman achieved recognition, and she knew that publishing it would make her even more controversial, but also transform the conversation from prurient gossip to substantive questions about women's place in British cultural life. Before leaving for London, she spoke with her aunt in the cottage parlour, where firelight cast familiar shadows, and the smell of linseed oil lingered in the air. "He tried to protect me by pushing me away," Arabella said, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "He does not understand that I did not survive the first scandal by hiding. I survived by creating work so true it could not be denied. I will survive this the same way. And if he loves me, if he truly loves me, he needs to let me choose to stand beside him, not make that choice for me." The journey to London took her through winter landscapes harsh and beautiful, snow covering the fells giving way to industrial cities, and finally to the capital where social tempest raged in drawing rooms and parliamentary chambers far removed from the Lake District's natural storms. She travelled second class with her artist's hands folded over her reticule that contained her letter to the Times, her face set with determination that made fellow passengers look away from the intensity in her grey-green eyes. Aunt Beatrice's Bloomsbury lodgings felt like a war room as they planned strategy. The familiar shabby comfort now charged with purpose as they discussed how best to deliver the letter and what consequences might follow. The Times offices were imposing and masculine, all dark wood and leather chairs and the smell of printer's ink. Skeptical editors initially dismissive of a woman wanting to publish a letter about art and scandal until they actually read what Arabella had written and recognized. That it was news, that it would sell papers, and more importantly would shift the entire conversation about the Thornbury exhibition from gossip to substantive cultural debate. The quality of winter light in London was harsh and unforgiving, illuminating everything without softness or mercy, appropriate for the moment of truth approaching, as Arabella prepared to publish words that would make her position clear and force Sebastian to confront whether he truly saw her as an equal, capable of making her own choices about risk and reputation, or whether his protectiveness revealed that, despite all his talk of partnership, he still fundamentally viewed her as someone who needed sheltering from consequences he thought she could not handle. The scandal had raised stakes to their highest point by threatening both the romantic and professional arcs simultaneously, forcing Arabella to choose between the safety of retreating to obscurity and the risk of claiming publicly her right to both her art and her love. And she chose risk with eyes wide open because she understood that being truly seen required being truly vulnerable, that validation meant nothing if purchased with silence about what mattered most. Arabella's letter to the Times was published on a cold morning in late November and created an immediate sensation that shifted public conversation from prurient scandal to substantive questions about women's place in British cultural life. And Aunt Beatrice read it aloud at breakfast in the Bloomsbury lodgings, while both women held their breath, waiting to see if the words that had cost Arabella so much effort would land with the impact she hoped. Progressive newspapers championed her immediately, recognizing that her letter articulated something larger than one woman's defense of her reputation, that it challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying how society valued or dismissed women's creative vision based on gendered expectations rather than actual merit. Women's rights advocates cited her words in their own publications, and several prominent artists and intellectuals published supporting letters to the Times affirming the quality of her work independent of any relationship with the Duke, most notably the painter Charles Tilney, who wrote with professional authority that he had examined Miss Fairfax's work extensively and found it demonstrated technical mastery comparable to Turner and emotional honesty exceeding most contemporary landscape work, that those who dismissed it did so not from artistic judgment, but from discomfort with a woman wielding such power with brush and palette that British art would be diminished if they silenced her voice. The tide began to turn as the conversation moved from gossip about improper romance to serious engagement with whether Parliament should retreat from controversial art or lead cultural progress, and Sebastian faced the parliamentary vote on whether to remove the exhibition, knowing that the outcome would determine not just Arabella's artistic future, but the larger question of whether institutional power would be used to support or suppress challenging voices. Arabella attended the parliamentary session secretly from the ladies' gallery, seated among wives and daughters who came to watch their men debate the nation's business, and she watched Sebastian rise to defend her work and their connection with her heart beating so hard she thought the women beside her must hear it. The parliamentary chamber was wood-panelled and gas-lit with the scent of old leather and male power, the space designed to intimidate and impress, and Sebastian stood before his peers with the same intensity she recognized from watching him examine her paintings in the cottage studio. My honorable colleagues suggest that art should dignify these halls with pleasant, uncontroversial beauty, he said with a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. I suggest that art should do what this Parliament should do. Tell the truth, however uncomfortable. Miss Fairfax's landscapes show Britain as it is, powerful, sometimes brutal, sublime. If we cannot hang such truth on our walls, how can we claim to speak truth in our debates? He acknowledged his personal regard for Miss Fairfax with devastating honesty, refusing to apologize or dissemble about feelings that had grown beyond patron and artist into something that mattered far more than political calculation. I have had the honor of knowing one of the finest minds and most courageous spirits in Britain, Sebastian told the assembled MPs. If that knowledge has led to deeper feeling, I will not apologize for it. Love built on genuine admiration is no scandal. It is rather the highest compliment I can offer and receive. During his speech, Sebastian looked up directly at where Arabella sat in the ladies' gallery, and their eyes met across the chamber in a moment of recognition and connection, so powerful she felt it like physical touch, and she understood that whatever happened with the vote, they had already won something more important, the right to choose each other openly, despite society's attempts to shame them into separation. His speech, combined with support from reformist MPs and the shifting public opinion created by her letter, won the vote. The exhibition would stay in parliamentary spaces, and more than that, Parliament voted to purchase 3 of Arabella's paintings for the permanent collection, transforming her from controversial temporary exhibitor to recognized permanent part of Britain's cultural heritage. Immediately after the vote, Sebastian left the chamber still in his parliamentary attire and went directly to Aunt Beatrice's lodgings, arriving breathless from having run through London streets in unseemly haste, and Arabella met him at the door with emotions too complex to name flooding through her. They confronted each other in the small, shabby parlor with paint-stained sketches on the walls, and the anger she had been carrying since receiving his letter of release poured out before he could speak. You do not get to decide what risks I take, Sebastian, she said with fierce clarity. You do not get to protect me by pushing me away. I am not a painting you can lock in a private gallery to keep safe. I am a woman who survived being destroyed once and rebuilt herself. I can survive scandal. The question is whether you can survive loving an equal instead of someone you can shelter. Sebastian met her anger with complete acceptance. No defensiveness or justification, just honest acknowledgement of his mistake. You are right, he said quietly. I tried to protect you as if you were fragile when everything about you is strong. Forgive me. I have spent my life in Parliament fighting for others' rights to choose their own paths, and then I denied you that very choice. I love you, Arabella, not as your patron or your protector, but as your partner, if you will have me. The anger gave way to vulnerability as they stood close enough to touch in the cramped lodgings, and Arabella felt the walls she had built against hoping for this moment crumble entirely. "I will have you," she told him, her voice shaking. "But understand, I will not stop painting. I will not soften my work. I will not be the decorative duchess. You will marry an artist who sometimes forgets dinner because the light is perfect, who will have paint on her gown at state functions, who will absolutely start political arguments at your parliamentary dinners." Sebastian smiled then with an expression of such joy and relief that it transformed his serious face. "I am counting on it," he said, and kissed her with the fierce equality of two people who had fought their way to each other through social opposition and personal doubt, who understood that their partnership was built on genuine recognition rather than romantic fantasy. The kiss was not gentle or tentative, but fierce and equal, and when they finally pulled apart, Aunt Beatrice was standing in the doorway with tea and an expression of deep satisfaction at having lived to see her niece claim both artistic success and love on her own uncompromising terms. They married quietly weeks later in a registry office with Aunt Beatrice and Sebastian's closest friend as witnesses, Arabella wearing a simple dress the color of storm clouds because she refused to perform bridal femininity even on her wedding day. And the ceremony was small and intimate and utterly unconcerned with society's opinion about how a duke should marry or what kind of woman deserved such elevation. 6 months later, in the summer of 1853, Arabella stood in a bright modern gallery where her paintings were prominently featured alongside other progressive artists, her work now being exhibited internationally as British art critics who had initially dismissed her scrambled to rewrite their assessments in light of her growing recognition. She was older now, more confident, with paint still permanently under her. Fingernails, and wearing expensive but practical clothes that Sebastian's wealth made possible, but which she chose for function rather than fashion, no longer performing femininity for anyone's expectations. Sebastian stood beside her as he had at the parliamentary exhibition, but now as her husband rather than her patron, and they watched as a young woman artist of perhaps 19 nervously exhibited her first landscapes, dark, powerful, true paintings that reminded Arabella painfully of her own early work and the courage it had required to show them publicly. The young artist approached Arabella with the same tearful gratitude Arabella herself had offered to the few women who had encouraged her, and Arabella found herself giving the advice she once desperately needed. "They will tell you to paint what is pretty, what is safe, what will not disturb anyone," she told the young woman with Sebastian's hand warm in hers. "Paint what is true instead. Paint what you see and feel, even if, especially if, it makes them uncomfortable, and when they criticize you, remember their discomfort means you are doing something important." The young artist asked the question Arabella had once asked herself in moments of doubt. "But what if they reject my work? What if no one wants to see what I have painted?" Arabella looked at this young woman standing where she had stood not so long ago, terrified and brave and clinging to artistic vision despite every social pressure to abandon it. "Then you will paint anyway," she said gently, "because the work matters more than the reception. And eventually, perhaps when you least expect it, someone will see what you have created and recognize its worth. Someone always does if you are brave enough to keep showing them who you truly are." The gallery around them was full of people engaged in serious discussion of art that challenged rather than comforted, and through the tall windows, Arabella could see London streets where women were beginning to claim spaces previously denied them, slowly and with tremendous opposition, but undeniably moving toward futures their mothers could not have imagined. On the wall behind her hung her painting of Grasmere in winter, the landscape where she and Sebastian had found each other, now part of the National Gallery's permanent collection alongside works by artists whose names would outlive them all. And she understood that the journey from mockery at a small gallery to this moment of recognition and influence had transformed her from victim of society's judgment to active challenger of society's limitations. She was not just successful herself, but enabling others' success, breaking the cycle of silencing that had nearly destroyed her creative spirit. And the young artist before her represented all the women who would benefit from Arabella's refusal to accept that feminine vision must be gentle and decorative and confined to acceptable subjects. Sebastian squeezed her hand and she turned to meet his eyes, storm grey and full of love and respect and partnership. And she knew that they would continue fighting together for what mattered. His parliamentary reforms and her artistic truth intertwined in shared conviction that power should serve justice rather than comfort, that institutions should lead progress rather than resist it, that love between equals who challenged each other to be better was worth any scandal society might manufacture. The story ended not with happily ever after, but with purposefully ever after, with two people who had chosen each other and chosen the hard work of making space in an unwelcoming world for voices that needed hearing. And as evening light fell golden through the gallery windows onto paintings that told truth about Britain's landscape and character, Arabella felt the deep satisfaction of having claimed not just artistic recognition, but the right to define success on her own terms, to be both artist and wife and public intellectual without apology or compromise, to show other women that survival was possible, and more than survival was possible if one was brave enough to keep painting truth even when the world insisted on pretty lies.